Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 1975 Ariens Snow Blower. Given its age of 50 years, it appears to be in excellent condition. That said though, it wouldn't be here if it didn't have a problem. And I'm told the problem is the 7-horse Tecumseh engine. Although it runs, it is leaking oil. So the owner, Kurt, brought it to a small engine shop to have him take a look. He was hoping it would just be an oil seal, but unfortunately, they say that this engine is suffering from high blow-by and likely needs to be rebuilt. The oil was coming out of the breather, and you can see some evidence of it right here. So before we dig in too deep, I do want to validate the shop's diagnosis, and if need be, we are going to rebuild this engine. This engine, or actually the snowblower, has sentimental value to Kurt. It belonged to his late father, and he wants to make it right again. So that is going to be the goal today. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So first things first, let's check the oil. Given it's leaking, we might need to add a little bit. So yeah, we're kind of on the low side of okay. Maybe a little bit below. So I'm going to top that off. We'll add a bit of fuel. I do want to get this started and just see with my own eyes what the problem is. Okay, perfect. We're just below the full mark. So that should be plenty to test with. So let's add a bit of fuel to the tank. And we'll pull the engine over and see what we see. Yeah, it looks like we got a fuel leak, so I'm going to shut the fuel valve off. I think the carb has had enough time to fill up, so we should be able to get the engine started at least for a short time. Well, I kind of went into this thinking this was going to be a long video, but based on the test we just did, I don't think that's the case. I did not see any smoke coming out of the exhaust, which tells me the oil ring is working properly. And more importantly, I did not see any oil or exhaust coming out of that breather right there. So the rings, I think they're doing what they should be. So this video is probably not going to be a rebuild video. Anyway, I am going to reach out to Kurt. I want to find out a little more information about this oil leak. And while I wait for that response, let's do a leak down test. Let's see how healthy the engine is, and we will go from there. I'm going to pull the starter recoil off. That'll let me position the crank where it needs to be for the leak down test. So right there, that is the beginning of the compression stroke. So I need to get the piston perfectly at top dead center so that when I apply pressure, the engine doesn't rotate. Plug was on there pretty loose. And let's also get this shroud off, because when we pressurize the cylinder, I want to see if there's any air leaking out of the intake valve. And to tell if it's leaking, we need to have access to the front of the carb. The carb looks pretty dirty, at least on the outside. I know it runs the engine, but I don't think it's been cleaned in a while. So we might clean that up at some point. But for now, let's do the leak down test. Okay, so I'm going to add some pressure. The gauge on the left measures the pressure going in, and the one on the right shows the percentage leak down. We want the least amount of leak down possible, but anywhere in the green would be considered good. So we need to bring the input pressure up to 100 psi, and then we read the leak down. So right now we're at 80 psi in, 90, and we're already in the green. And at 100 psi in, we're not too bad. We're at about 30% leak down, which is actually pretty good, especially given its age. Now we are leaking a little bit past the intake valve, maybe a little bit past the exhaust. And if I open up the oil fill, yeah, that is where the majority of the leak down is, past the rings. But even so, 30%, that's a healthy engine. For a 50-year-old machine, you really can't ask for much better. So, yeah, I don't think we have any issues with this engine. Well, I know some of you probably wanted to see a rebuild video on a 7-horse Tecumseh, but there is no reason to rebuild this engine. As far as I can tell, it is healthy. And I did hear back from Kurt as well, as far as the oil leak. My question to him was the oil leaking when the engine was running or when it was in storage? And his answer was in storage. So that eliminates blow-by, because that only happens when the engine's running. That also eliminates the oil seals as the problem. So if I had to guess, I would say either this cap is loose or maybe the pipe is. So let's check that real quick, see if either one of those is loose. Well, that might be the problem there. The cap, I wouldn't call it loose, but it definitely wasn't tight. And now it is. So that could have been the problem all along. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that that likely was the oil leak. So now that that's tight, I think we can cross oil leak off the list. But we do still have another pretty big leak, which is this fuel line right here. And judging by the paint on the line, I would say that that's original to the machine and definitely should be replaced. So we will replace that. I'm thinking while we're at it, let's get the carb cleaned up and we'll check the valve clearance. This is something that is often neglected, and on a 50-year-old machine, that might be well past due. So this fuel line, it's absolutely petrified. So I am just going to cut it off. And then we have, looks like 2 nuts right there. So we'll loosen those up. And I think this whole bracket is going to come off with the carburetor. All right, that one's coming off. Pretty tight though, so I don't think this carb's been off in quite a while. Yeah, it's coming out, but it's almost like it's taking the whole stud. Yeah, I don't know about this one. It's spinning, but there is no progress being made. So I actually see there are some screws further down. So I'm thinking these are just bolts with a nut, and I'm just spinning actually the whole thing without actually loosening it up. So let's try to get a screwdriver on those and see if the whole manifold will just come off of there. Now I'm going to strip that out at that kind of an angle. So I'm kind of at a loss here as far as how to proceed, because these nuts, they're just spinning with the bolt, and the bolt is not accessible. So the only way to get this off is to get these screws back here. Now I did break that one loose, but this one, the angle is such that, you know, if I keep going, I might strip that out. So this is what I'm dealing with here. There is a nut right there, but the bolt spins with it, so we can't get it off. There is a screw further in, which that one I did crack free, but you can't even back it all the way out because it hits the bracket. And on the other side, we have the same problem with that nut. The bolt is just spinning, and we have another screw right there. And I cannot get a straight shot on it. And you can see, you know, it is starting to strip. So yeah, this one I'm going to have to give some thought, because if I keep going, I think I'm going to cause a problem. So yeah, let me give this one some thought. There has to be an easier way to get this off. I think that might be it. Yep. Well, there's our prize. And I was not expecting this one to be so hard to get off. This was actually one of the hardest carbs I have ever removed. And I think it's safe to say it hasn't been removed in a while. This was not an easy task. You know, the issue was that these nuts were just spinning with the bolt. And the reason for that was because these were actually screws and they were just turning along with the nut. So that was not an option. We did have to break these free. And even once we did, it was kind of hard because these are captured. You can't screw them all the way out. You can only give them about a half turn on each side until the whole thing came out. Anyway, we'll circle back on this in a minute. You know, I want to keep going because the ultimate goal here is to get access to the valve cover, and the exhaust is in the way. So we do need to try to loosen these up and get the exhaust out of the way, and that'll give us the access we need to the valve cover. So what do you think the odds are of this exhaust coming off? Oh, we got one. And two. Interesting. There is a lot of oil up here. And this thing kind of sprung out, which is a little bit unusual. But it actually looks pretty good in here. You know, I was thinking for a second there that maybe that drain was clogged, but that's not the case. All right, let's check the valves. The engine, it's still at top dead center from when we did the Leakdown test. So we'll start with the intake valve. That is the valve on the right. Should be 8/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000th. And the 8/1000ths fits kind of loose. So let's try a 10. 10 feels pretty good. Decent amount of drag. Let's try an 11. And no, the 11 does not fit. So the intake, it's pretty close. It's about 2/1000ths over. Let's check the exhaust. It should be 12/1000ths of an inch. And 12/1000ths does not fit. Let's try a 10. And the 10 fits with a fair amount of drag. So the valves, although they're not absolutely perfect, they are very close. So I'm going to leave good enough alone. All right, first things first, let's get this bracket out of the way. Okay, and this insulator I'm going to leave in place. You know, the gasket's still good, but if I try to separate it, likely it won't be. So let's see where the main jet needle is before we take it out. There's half, 1, 1 1/4 on the main jet. And this bowl nut's coming out pretty tight, which is not a good sign. It usually means that there is some buildup in there. Yeah, a little bit of buildup, but not too bad. Yeah, and the inside of the carb actually looks pretty good. Looks a lot better actually than the outside. So, you know, we knew the carb ran the engine actually pretty well. But since we're here, you know, we should clean it up. And let's pull the pilot needle. So we'll check how far out it is. Half a turn. And maybe a little more. I don't want to force it. It actually feels pretty gummy, so it's hard to tell if it's bottomed out. But it looks like it's about half a turn out. Maybe a little bit more. And there is a washer in there as well as an O-ring. So I'm going to try to fish those out. Usually they kind of fall out in the ultrasonic. So let's try to get it out now before we lose it. All right, I'm not going to force it. It's in there pretty tight, so I don't want to damage it. Anyway, it's a pretty simple carb. There's not a whole lot more to it. That emulsion tube, I believe, is removable, but you know, usually I don't have to pull them out. And actually, you know, I think I'm going to leave that in there because they can break. And right now, the carb was running the engine well, so I don't think we need to pull that out. Carb cleaned up pretty well. Not that it was that dirty on the inside, but now it is absolutely spotless, both inside and out. So let's get this back together, you know, starting with the needle and the float. And the flat part here, that aligns with the hinge, so make sure you get that right. And we'll just tighten it down. Bowl nut goes on much better. There's half, 1, 1 1/4. And the washer did fall out. So we'll get that back on. Okay, and that should do it. I'm going to reattach the bracket, and likely we're going to have to fine tune the needles once the machine is up and running again. I'm going to leave the carb off for now because I did damage the gasket when pulling it off, so I need to order a new one of those up. And also the exhaust gasket ripped as well. And I also noticed, now that this is off, we have an issue inside the exhaust. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there is a baffle or something kind of floating around in there. So, you know, these mufflers, they don't cost a whole lot. I think they're just over $30. So I'm going to get a new one of those ordered up as well. So for now, I'm thinking let's just clean up the oil and then we'll turn our attention to the fuel line. We'll clean this up real good. That way, if it is leaking, it'll be pretty obvious. You can see the damage right there. So the clip, for some reason, there was an extra clip on the fuel line, and it looks like that did the fuel line in. So I'm going to cut that off the barb. You know, I don't want to damage the bushing. It looks to be in good shape. And then we'll get a new line fed in. Yeah, it's a little bit long, which is fine. We'll cut it to size once the carb's installed. So I think we'll get the starter recoil back on. You know, we only took it off to make it easier to find top dead center. So once this is back on, I think I'm going to drain the oil because, you know, I want to stand the snowblower up to fix the problem with the shifter. And we have to change the oil anyway. So we'll get that out and take care of this shifting issue. Gonna take a while for that oil to drain, so let's just check the auger, make sure that the worm drive has some gear oil. Yeah, we might be a little bit low, but there is gear oil in there, and it looks to be pretty clean. So, you know, I would like to top that off. I actually don't have the right weight on hand, so I'm going to add that to the list, and we'll circle back on that in a bit. And there's an up close look at the oil. You know, besides being well used, I don't see any evidence of any metal in that oil. So the engine would appear to be in good shape. So I'm going to move the gear selector, and what we should see is that this disc will slide back and forth. Now it does look pretty good, so I'm actually a little surprised it doesn't move a little better. But let's move it and just see kind of where the issue is. Yeah, it's actually not too bad. So I'm going to clean off this old grease. We'll put a little bit of fresh stuff on there, and I think we'll be good. And I'm going to use some low temperature grease. It's good to -45, which hopefully we never see in my area. And you don't want to put too much on, because if this flies off and hits the friction disc, then you're not going to get traction. It's just going to slip. I'm absolutely amazed at how good a condition this machine's in. You know, I've worked on machines quite a bit younger than this, that were in terrible condition. You know, this one is built well, seems to have held up well, so I can definitely see how Ariens has such a good reputation. So that should be good. The chain actually looks like it's greased, but we'll add just a little bit more while we're in here. Now we'll get some oil back in the engine. You know, if I believe the internet, this should take about 19 ounces of oil, about 600 milliliters. So we will put that much in and double check the oil dipstick. And yeah, that is right at the full mark. So there's not a whole lot more we can do until we get the parts that are on order. That said, though, I did just double check the scraper height. You know, it should be about 3/16 of an inch off the ground. And this one is actually riding right on the ground. There is no gap. So like that, the scraper is going to wear out. And once that scraper is worn enough, it's actually going to start wearing into the bucket, which could permanently damage the machine. So I'm going to elevate it by 3/16 of an inch. You know, we'll drop those shoes down, and then I think we'll be in good shape. And paint sticks, they are the perfect gap. So I'm just going to put one on each side, and then we'll drop the shoes. I put a light on the other side just so you could see that it is shining through the gap. You know, prior to the adjustment, there would have been no light coming through, or at least very little. And now we do have a good gap running the whole way across. So this is a neglected adjustment. And if you ignore it, you are going to destroy your snowblower. Anyway, we're all set. You know, I think I've taken this as far as I can for now. So when we get the parts, we will finish this up. And with any luck, we'll get some snow and try this machine out. Well, it's been a few days, and the parts we need to finish this up have arrived. We have some 80/90 gear oil, a new exhaust, and some gaskets for the carburetor as well as the exhaust. So I'm going to start with the gear oil. You know, it's probably going to take a while to drain out, So I'm going to get the drain plug pulled, and while we're waiting for that, we'll get the new exhaust and the cleaned carburetor reinstalled. Uh-oh. I think it's been a while since this has been off. Either that or it's cross-threaded because it's turning, but not very well. There we go. So we'll just get what remains of this old gasket off. I probably could have just waited and done the gear oil before moving on. It's actually done draining. There wasn't a whole lot in there. So we'll have to double check once we fill that back up and just keep an eye on it. You know, we could have a bad seal potentially. Either that or maybe it was just underfilled. Okay, we've got the new gasket in place. I think before we get the carb on, I want to get the governor spring reconnected. It's actually on the bracket right here. It's a pretty small spring. I actually thought it was a anti-surge spring, but that is not the case since it's connected right here to where the throttle cable goes. So we just need to get it on here and slide it up like that. And then we'll connect the governor rod to the carb like that. And the new gasket's already installed. So just tighten it up. And I think we want to cut that right about there. I just realized I left something out here. Not sure why, but it had a gasket and a metal plate. You know, the metal plate, I would say, might be to protect the car body from getting scratched up by this primer. But the gasket, I'm not sure about. I mean, this has no air filter. Maybe it's for the same reason. It provides kind of like a soft layer between the aluminum and the steel bracket. Or it could be to make a better seal. Not sure. Let's just double check the calibration. Right now we are in full throttle, coding to the lever up above, and same down below. And if we pull this back, looks like we got full range of motion, because right there is stop, and it's making contact where it should. So let's get the wire reconnected right there, and then we'll be ready to get the cover back on. Actually, I'm going to hold off getting this cover back on. Although I can adjust the main jet with the cover on, I don't think I can adjust the pilot needle. So I do actually want to get the engine running first. We'll set the jetting appropriately, and then we can get that cover on as the last step. So I'm thinking before we start the engine, let's refill the gearbox. Not a whole lot came out. And I guess the good news is I don't see any metal in there, but it does make me wonder why we're low on oil. Okay, I think that's tight. So now we'll just fill it up until it's spilling out. So I put a piece of 1/4-inch fuel line on this bottle, hoping that it will make less of a mess like this. Okay, that's it. So I'll just give it a second. It's a little bit overfilled. Once that stops, put the cap back on. Well, I think today's the day we try this thing out. We were supposed to get 1/2 foot of snow, and instead we got about 3 or 4 inches, so not quite as good of a test as I was hoping for, but I think it'll be good enough. I don't suspect we're going to see excessive blow-by or any oil blowing out of the breather, but I am still suspicious of the drain tube over here. What I noticed is that it is slowly weeping, even though it's been tightened up. It's very slow. It takes about a week, but there is oil coming out of it. So, yeah, I could tighten it up more. I could use some thread sealant, but I'm thinking, it's cheap enough just to replace these parts. But for now, let's just test it, make sure the engine's good. And assuming it is, we'll just order up what we need. All right, my son wants to have a try. He's pretty impressed with his old machine. I've got to say, I'm pretty impressed with this machine. It is the perfect size. The horsepower is perfect. And the controls, they are really easy to operate. So I can see where Ariens got its good name. You know, it's from machines like this. Anyway, as far as the blow-by goes, I didn't see any. There is no oil. I didn't see any smoke coming out of that breather tube. So the engine, I think it's fine. aside from that little leak on that pipe, I don't think there's really a whole lot more to do here. So I'm going to pause it. I'm going to get that part ordered up. And when it gets here, we'll finish this up. All right, I think it's time to finish this up. I've got most of the oil drained out. I've got the parts I need. So let's get the old pipe out. We'll install the new parts and call this one done. So this is a pretty awkward space to get into. I do have a pipe wrench, but there is no chance of it fitting in here. So we're going to have to try with the vice grips and hope that that's good enough. Yep, there we go. And I did also prop this machine so that, any oil that's left in there hopefully is on the other side of the engine. And for the new pipe, I'm just going to use a little bit of thread locker on the engine side to help keep the pipe in. That way when you turn the plug out, hopefully you don't turn the whole pipe. Well, guys, I think that's pretty much it. We got lucky on this one. And I went into it thinking we needed an engine rebuild. And as it turned out, the engine was in very good condition. And really, the whole machine is in fantastic shape. Especially when you consider the age and the fact that this was used in the blizzard of '78 is pretty impressive. I don't think there's many snowblowers left that can make that claim. And I actually have a perfect example over here. This is a much newer model. This was made in 2010. And you can see what usually happens to these machines. They rust out, things break, and they get thrown away. So there will be a video on this soon. But for now, this one, I think we're done. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.